The lights in the county morgue flickered faintly, humming with that sterile, unfeeling buzz that always seemed to accompany death. On a cold stainless steel table lay the body of Harold Bennett, 62 years old, covered in a white sheet that could never hide the truth. The attendant pulled the sheet back. Harold's face, once flushed with the warmth of a man in love, was now drained of color, lips pale, eyes shut as if mid-thought. His hair, silver but neatly trimmed, framed a face that still carried the pride of a decorated veteran. "Time of death," the medical examiner said flatly, scribbling in her chart. 11:43 p.m., less than 6 hours after admission. Less than 24 hours earlier, Harold had been standing under a white arch in his backyard, smiling for photographs beside a woman young enough to be his daughter. Alyssa Moore, 31 years old, a hospital nurse with the kind of beauty that made people turn their heads twice. Friends described the wedding as unexpected but sweet. Some called it a second chance for a man who'd lost his wife years before. Others, quietly, called it reckless. Now, the second chance was over. Forever. What made this death impossible to ignore was not Harold's age, nor the swiftness of his decline, but the medical finding that hit the staff like a punch to the gut. He had died from a massive, overwhelming infection. Traces of HIV were detected in his blood. His medical records from just 2 months ago were clear, HIV negative. The speed, the timing, it didn't make sense. The attending ER physician whispered to the coroner, "You don't go from negative to dead from this in a day, unless someone intended it." And that was when the name Alyssa Moore first appeared in the police report as more than newlywed spouse. She had been the last person to see Harold alive, the one to call 911, the one who told paramedics she couldn't understand why he was suddenly so sick. To the neighbors, Alyssa was polite but distant, a woman who seemed to always be calculating something behind her soft smile. She'd moved into Harold's life quickly, and some said too quickly. The age gap had stirred gossip at the diner and the barber shop. Harold had brushed it off with a chuckle. "Let them talk," he told his son. "I know what I'm doing." But now, as Detective Marianne Cole zipped the body bag closed and signed off for evidence transfer, the question hung in the cold air like the smell of disinfectant. Was this the tragic, unforeseeable death of an older man, or the final move in a carefully laid plan that began long before Harold ever said, "I do"? Somewhere in the quiet corridors of the hospital, Alyssa Moore sat alone, her hands folded in her lap, waiting to be called in for a few routine questions. She didn't know, or maybe she did, that from this moment on, every breath she took would be under the weight of suspicion. Before his name became a headline, Harold Bennett was the kind of man you'd trust to watch your back and your home without thinking twice. A retired army sergeant, he had served in 2 tours overseas, carried more scars than he cared to talk about, and returned to small-town Texas with a chest full of medals that mostly collected dust in a shoebox under his bed. 7 years ago, Harold lost his wife, Margaret, to cancer. Friends said she'd been his anchor, the one who could calm the storms that war and life had left in him. Her death hollowed him out. He filled his days with volunteer work at the Veterans Center, fishing on weekends, and the occasional card game at the VFW Hall. But nights were long and quiet. Too quiet. It was on one of those ordinary days, a spring afternoon, that Harold's path crossed with Alyssa Moore. He'd been fixing a loose gutter at home, slipped off the ladder, and landed badly on his shoulder. The ER wasn't busy that day, and that's where she came in, efficient, gentle, with a smile that felt like sunlight through storm clouds. "You've got lucky bones, Mr. Bennett," she said, adjusting his sling with careful hands. "Lucky enough to meet you," Harold replied, half joking, but Alyssa didn't shy away. She met his eyes and smiled back. From that day on, Harold found excuses to stop by the hospital, to drop off donuts for the staff, to check on a nagging ache that seemed to come and go. Alyssa never turned him away. She listened, laughed at his old army stories, and sometimes leaned in just close enough for Harold to notice the faint scent of her perfume. Within months, she was visiting his house for dinner, her car parked discreetly out front. Harold's son, David, noticed. "Dad," he'd warned one night, "she's 31. She could be my little sister. You really think this is about love?" Harold's jaw had set in that stubborn way his family knew too well. "Son, I've seen enough of life to know when someone's real. Alyssa's real." But not everyone agreed. At the diner, whispers followed them when they walked in. "Gold digger," someone muttered over coffee. At the hardware store, a friend asked Harold if he'd signed a prenup. Harold would just laugh, wave it off. "They don't know her like I do." In truth, Harold felt alive again. The way Alyssa touched his arm when she spoke, the way she laughed at his dry humor, it was more than attention, it was revival. She had a way of making him forget the quiet nights, the ache in his bones, the feeling that life was something happening to other people. If Harold noticed the shadows in Alyssa's eyes when she thought no one was looking, he didn't mention it. If he wondered why she sometimes asked questions about his time in the army, about names and dates he hadn't thought about in decades, he kept it to himself. Because Harold Bennett believed in second chances. He just didn't know that, for him, the second chance would last less than a day after saying "I do." If Harold's past was written in medals and service records, Alyssa Moore's history was a book with torn-out pages. She'd grown up in the shadow of Fort Bragg, the daughter of Staff Sergeant Daniel Moore, a man as disciplined at home as he was on base. Her mother had died young, leaving Alyssa to be raised mostly by her grandmother. By 16, she knew how to cook for herself, manage a household, and read the tension in a man's eyes before he ever spoke a word. Her father was her hero, until the day a uniformed officer knocked on their door. The official report said it was a training accident overseas. The flag-folded triangle they handed her was stiff and cold in her lap. But even at 17, Alyssa sensed there was more to the story. Years later, in nursing school, she stumbled on an old newspaper clipping about that same deployment. Buried in the article was a brief mention of Sergeant Harold Bennett, one of the last to see her father alive. That name stuck in her mind like a splinter. Life moved on, at least on the surface. Alyssa graduated, worked long shifts in ER wards, and learned to smile for patients while masking her exhaustion. Her looks, dark hair, warm skin, eyes that seemed to hold secrets, often drew attention, and more than once she blurred the line between professional and personal with patients or colleagues. A quiet HR warning here, a whispered rumor there. But behind that polished exterior, a seed of anger had been growing. She wanted answers about her father's death, and the man who might have them. She didn't know how she'd get close enough to him, until fate handed her Harold Bennett, walking into her ER with a busted shoulder. From the start, she played the role to perfection. The attentive nurse, the patient listener, the young woman who seemed touched by his stories. But in the quiet moments, when Harold's guard was down, she'd drop in a question about deployments, about old buddies, about missions in the summer of '95. Harold would pause, sometimes long enough for her to notice the flicker of something, discomfort, maybe guilt, before changing the subject. To Alyssa, that flicker was enough. Enough to convince her that the man now courting her knew more than he'd ever admit. Enough to start shaping a plan in her mind. She accepted his dinner invitations. She let the relationship bloom in the eyes of the town. She let him think he'd rescued her from loneliness, when in truth she was charting every step toward a wedding day that, in her mind, would double as an execution date. If anyone asked, Alyssa would say she'd been unlucky in love. But the truth was far darker. This wasn't about love at all. This was about finishing what she believed the army had failed to do, delivering justice for Daniel Moore. And Harold Bennett was going to be the one to pay. The Bennett backyard had been transformed for the occasion. White folding chairs lined the grass, a rented arch draped in silk flowers, and a string quartet softly playing, "At Last." Harold stood tall at the front, his suit pressed, his silver hair combed to military precision. He looked every bit the groom who believed his life was about to start over. Alyssa walked down the aisle on her grandmother's arm, her ivory dress simple but cut to perfection, catching the light with each step. Guests turned to watch, some smiling warmly, others whispering behind polite hands. In a town this size, everyone knew the age gap, and everyone had an opinion. When she reached Harold, he took her hands, and for a moment, the scene was pure romance. They exchanged vows, his voice steady, hers soft and deliberate. But to those watching closely, there was something in Alyssa's gaze. It wasn't shy, nor entirely tender. It was measured, like a person memorizing the moment for reasons beyond love. During the reception, Harold made the rounds, thanking guests, introducing Alyssa to old army buddies who'd come to pay their respects to his new life. She was gracious, smiling just enough, but never lingering too long with anyone. At one point, David Bennett pulled his father aside near the punch table. "Dad," he murmured, "she barely eats, barely drinks, and she won't even take a photo with you alone. Doesn't that seem off?" Harold chuckled, brushing it off. "She's just nervous. Give her time, son." Across the lawn, Alyssa's grandmother sat quietly, watching her granddaughter with an expression that could have been pride, or something more guarded. As the sun dipped low, the music shifted to slow dances. Harold and Alyssa swayed under the fairy lights. She rested her head against his chest, and he thought she felt warm, safe. What he didn't see was the way her eyes opened, glancing over his shoulder at the clock on the patio wall, as if she were counting down. Friends later recalled small oddities, Alyssa refusing champagne for the toast, claiming she didn't want to get tipsy, and her insistence on leaving the party early, just the two of them. Harold thought it was romantic, escaping before the clean-up began. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Bennet?" he asked, his hand warm around hers. Her lips curled into a smile. "More than ready." By nightfall, the chairs were folded, the lights dimmed, and the guests gone. In the quiet of their bedroom, with the scent of wedding flowers still clinging to her hair, Alyssa would take the next step in a plan she had been refining for years, one that Harold still believed was the start of forever. But forever, for Harold Bennett, had less than 24 hours left. The front door closed behind them with a soft click, shutting out the distant hum of the last cars leaving the reception. The Bennett house smelled faintly of cedar and the roses Alyssa had placed in a crystal vase that morning. Harold loosened his tie, his eyes warm with the quiet pride of a man who believed the hardest chapters of his life were behind him. Alyssa slipped off her shoes, her bare feet making no sound against the polished wood floor. "I'll pour us some champagne," she said, moving toward the kitchen. "You didn't drink at the reception," Harold teased, leaning against the doorway. "Saving it for now," she answered, her smile slow and deliberate. She returned with 2 glasses, the pale gold liquid catching the lamplight. They toasted, to love, to second chances, and Harold drained his in a few gulps, never noticing she barely wet her lips. Later, in the bedroom, Alyssa lit a single candle on the dresser. Shadows stretched along the walls, softening the room, blurring its edges. She stepped close, letting her fingertips graze his collar before sliding it from his shoulders. Harold felt 20 years younger under her touch. "Stay right there," she murmured, reaching into the nightstand drawer. He thought nothing of it when she unwrapped a condom, her movements practiced but unhurried. She turned slightly, her back to him for just a moment longer than necessary, enough time for her fingers to trace the edge of something she had prepared long before tonight. When she faced him again, the smile was back, her eyes locked on his. Whatever else lived behind that look, Harold could not see. The rest of the night was slow, deliberate. To Harold, it was intimacy. To Alyssa, it was execution masked as passion. She guided every movement, never letting the moment slip beyond her control. Afterward, Harold lay back against the pillows, his breathing steady, a rare smile softening his features. "You make me feel like a young man again," he said. Alyssa, still catching her breath, reached over to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. "That's all I wanted," she replied, and for a heartbeat it almost sounded true. But as Harold drifted toward sleep, Alyssa slipped from the bed, carrying the used condom to the bathroom. The faint hiss of running water masked the sound of plastic crinkling as she retrieved a small sealed bag from the lining of her robe, the bag she had hidden weeks earlier. With practiced hands, she disposed of the evidence she didn't want found, tucking the rest deep in the trash under a layer of tissues. When she returned, Harold was already asleep, his chest rising and falling in the dim light. Alyssa stood over him for a long moment, her face unreadable. In less than 12 hours, the man sleeping so peacefully would be fighting for his life, and she would be right there, holding his hand, pretending she didn't know why. The morning light slipped in through the blinds, cutting pale stripes across the bedroom. Harold stirred first, blinking against the brightness. At first, it was just a dull ache behind his eyes, the kind a man might blame on too much champagne and not enough sleep. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, but the motion sent a wave of nausea rolling through him. From the bathroom, Alyssa's voice floated out, calm and casual. "Coffee or tea this morning?" "Coffee," Harold said, rubbing his temples. His voice sounded hoarse, even to himself. "Strong." She stepped out in her robe, carrying herself with the same unhurried grace as the night before. "You don't look so good," she said lightly, as if she'd just noticed. "Didn't sleep great," he admitted. But as he spoke, a shiver rippled through him, despite the Texas heat already pressing against the windows. By the time Alyssa brought his coffee, beads of sweat had formed along his hairline. He sipped slowly, his hand trembling enough to rattle the spoon against the cup. "You should lie back down," she suggested, setting the mug on the nightstand. "I'm fine," Harold said, the same stubborn tone he'd used in the army when told to see a medic. But 15 minutes later, his breath came shorter, and the fine sheen of sweat had turned into a slick layer across his skin. Alyssa perched on the edge of the bed, placing a hand on his forehead. "You're burning up." "I'll be all right." "Probably just a bug," he said, forcing a weak smile. But his eyes betrayed him. The fatigue was deeper than anything he'd felt before. As the morning wore on, his symptoms worsened. A pounding headache, muscle aches, and a fever climbing so fast it seemed unreal. When he tried to stand, his knees buckled, and Alyssa caught his arm, guiding him back to the bed with surprising gentleness. "Stay put," she said. "I'll call for help if you need it." By early afternoon, Harold's breathing had grown ragged. He no longer argued when Alyssa picked up the phone to dial 911. "This is Alyssa Bennett," she told the dispatcher, her voice steady. "My husband is very ill. He's deteriorating quickly." Within minutes, paramedics were wheeling Harold out on a gurney. He tried to speak, his lips forming words she couldn't, or wouldn't, hear over the commotion. Alyssa followed close behind, one hand resting lightly on the rail of the stretcher, her expression etched with a perfect blend of worry and confusion. To anyone watching, she was the devoted new bride terrified for her husband's life. But inside, Alyssa knew exactly what was happening, and she also knew there was no stopping it now. The ambulance tore through the quiet Sunday streets, siren wailing, as Harold's eyes fluttered open and closed in a haze. The paramedic at his side kept repeating, "Stay with me, sir. Just keep your eyes on me." By the time they reached the ER, Harold's fever had spiked past 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Monitors beeped in a frantic rhythm as nurses rushed to stabilize him. Alyssa stood just outside the curtain, clutching her robe at the chest, her face pale in the fluorescent light. To the casual observer, she was the picture of a terrified wife. Inside the trauma bay, the attending physician, Dr. Klein, frowned as he scanned Harold's chart. "This doesn't add up," he muttered to a nurse. "He was HIV negative in his last physical. What, 8 weeks ago?" "Yes, sir. According to his primary care records." Blood was drawn, fluids pushed, but Harold's body was shutting down faster than anyone could explain. Sepsis had taken hold, overwhelming his system like a wildfire. Alyssa was finally allowed in, sitting beside him, holding his hand. "I'm here, Harold," she whispered, brushing damp hair from his forehead. His eyes opened briefly, confusion swimming in them. His lips moved, but the words were faint, something about why and hurts. At 11:43 p.m., the steady tone of the heart monitor filled the room. Dr. Klein stepped forward, placed his stethoscope against Harold's chest, then quietly called the time of death. The staff bowed their heads for a moment of silence, a courtesy for a veteran whose battles had finally ended. Alyssa let out a sob that seemed rehearsed, not too loud, not too quiet, and leaned into the nurse's shoulder. She accepted the murmured condolences, her eyes dry within seconds. When the body was transferred to the morgue, standard protocol demanded a full panel of post-mortem tests. Hours later, the lab report landed on Dr. Klein's desk, and what he read made his hand freeze midair. HIV positive. Viral load off the charts. Evidence of multiple strains. He stared at the paper, then looked back at Harold's clean medical history from 2 months earlier. There was no medical explanation for how someone could go from a negative result to this level of infection so quickly, unless the exposure was intentional and recent. Very recent. By morning, whispers were moving through the hospital. Words like deliberate transmission and criminal act crept into conversations at the nurses' station. Detective Marianne Cole got the call just after sunrise. 62-year-old male, dead less than a day after his wedding. Labs saying the HIV's fresh. This isn't your average medical case. When Marianne arrived at the hospital, she found Alyssa in the family waiting area, sipping from a styrofoam cup of coffee. She looked up, her expression composed, even tired. "I'm Detective Cole," Marianne said, pulling up a chair. "I'm sorry for your loss, but I need to ask you some questions about your wedding night." Alyssa blinked slowly, then nodded. "Of course, Detective. Anything to help." And just like that, the clock began ticking, not toward saving Harold Bennett, but toward uncovering how and why he'd been sent to the morgue less than 24 hours after saying "I do." Detective Marianne Cole had seen enough sudden death cases to know when something smelled wrong, and this one reeked. Harold Bennett wasn't just a veteran who died unexpectedly. He was a man whose medical history had been spotless until the day after his wedding. The numbers from the lab screamed deliberate exposure. The first step was Harold's home. Marianne arrived with a forensics team early Monday morning. The backyard still bore traces of the reception, crushed grass where the chairs had been, petals scattered along the stone path. Inside, the faint scent of roses and candle wax lingered in the bedroom. "Bag everything that looks like it's from last night," Marianne ordered. Gloves snapped, evidence bags rustled. One of the techs called out from the master bathroom, "Detective, you'll want to see this." On the counter sat an empty champagne flute and a small trash bin lined with tissues. Beneath the tissues, partially wrapped in toilet paper, was a used condom. The tech slid it into an evidence bag, sealing it with a bright red tag. "Get that to the lab priority 1, Marianne said. Her instincts told her this might be the key. By afternoon, The lab report came back, and it was damning. The condom contained traces of Harold's DNA, and semen from another unidentified male. Both samples tested HIV positive, and worse, they were from different strains. It was a cocktail that would all but guarantee rapid infection. Mary Ann stared at the report. Whoever prepared this hadn't just wanted Harold infected. They'd wanted it to be lethal, fast. She returned to the hospital, where Alyssa was finishing paperwork to release Harold's body. The young widow looked tired, her hair pulled back neatly, makeup minimal. "Mrs. Bennet," Mary Ann began, her tone even, "we found something in your home that raises a few questions." Alyssa tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Questions? A condom from last night. It contained DNA that wasn't your husband's. Care to explain?" For the briefest moment, Alyssa's eyes flickered, not with shock, but calculation. Then she gave a small, almost pitying smile. "Detective, my husband was 62. We used protection because it was safer for both of us. As for the other DNA, I have no idea how that could be. Maybe a mix-up at your lab." Mary Ann leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "This isn't my first day, Mrs. Bennet, and it's not the lab's either. You and I both know that condom didn't get there by accident." Alyssa didn't flinch. "Then prove it." Mary Ann straightened, her mind already racing through the next steps. If Alyssa thought this would be an easy conversation, she was wrong. This wasn't just about a sudden death anymore. It was about intent, planning, and a weapon that didn't involve a single bullet. And Mary Ann Cole was going to find out exactly when Alyssa Moore had decided that her wedding night would also be Harold Bennett's last. Detective Mary Ann Cole knew cases like this never started on the wedding night. They started years earlier, sometimes decades, with a moment, a grudge, a wound that never healed. She sat at her desk long after the station had gone quiet, flipping through Harold Bennett's service file. Most of it was routine, training records, commendations, deployments. But in the middle of the stack was a thin manila folder stamped restricted. Inside, a single report from 1995 detailed an accidental live-fire incident during a classified training exercise overseas. One soldier dead, Staff Sergeant Daniel Moore. Mary Ann's eyes narrowed. She didn't need Google to connect the name. Daniel Moore was Alyssa's father. The report claimed Moore was struck by stray fire during a nighttime drill. Witnesses were vague, citing low visibility and confusion on the line. Harold Bennett's name appeared in the witness list, his statement a neat paragraph that echoed the official conclusion, a tragic accident. But accidents didn't haunt people like this. Not for decades. Not enough to send a man to the morgue with a weapon only someone in the medical field could prepare. The next morning, Mary Ann tracked down Tommy Greer, a retired sergeant who'd served with both Harold and Moore. She found him on his porch, coffee in hand, a faded USMC cap pulled low. "Daniel Moore," she began without preamble. "What really happened that night?" Tommy's eyes flicked up, sharp despite his age. "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time." "His daughter just buried her husband," Mary Ann said. "I think you know the connection." Tommy sighed, setting his mug down. "There was no accident." Moore was pushing for an investigation into some off-the-books supply deals. Bennett was part of the detail that night. Shots rang out. Moore went down. Afterward, everybody was told to stick to the accident story or kiss their careers goodbye. Bennett didn't pull the trigger far as I know, but he kept his mouth shut. That was enough. Mary Ann felt the pieces click into place. Alyssa hadn't just married Harold. She'd hunted him. She'd gotten close, waited, and then delivered the kind of payback her father never got. Back at the station, Marianne stared at the photo from Harold and Alyssa's wedding, taken less than 24 hours before his death. In it, Alyssa's hand rested lightly on Harold's chest, her smile perfectly composed. But now Marianne could see it. Not love, not joy. Something colder. The satisfaction of a plan already in motion. If the motive was revenge, Marianne knew the challenge ahead, proving intent beyond doubt. And with Alyssa's background as a nurse, the weapon she'd chosen was as hard to trace as it was devastating. But one thing was certain. This wasn't just a homicide case anymore. This was a vendetta decades in the making. The interview room was small, windowless, and deliberately plain. A table, 2 chairs, and the quiet hum of a wall vent. Detective Marianne Cole sat at one side, a slim case file in front of her. Across from her, Alyssa Moore Bennett folded her hands neatly, as if she were waiting for a patient consultation instead of a police interview. Marianne opened the file slowly, letting the silence stretch. "We've been looking into your late husband's military history," she began, her tone calm but edged. "He served with a man named Daniel Moore. That name ring a bell." Alyssa didn't blink. "He was my father." "Your father died in 1995, Marianne continued. "Officially, it was a training accident, but unofficially, people say it was something else. They also say Harold Bennett was there when it happened." For a split second, Alyssa's gaze sharpened, then softened again. "Detective, I've lived with the story of my father's death for most of my life. It doesn't make Harold a killer." "No," Marianne agreed, leaning forward, "but it makes him a man who stayed silent while your father's name was buried with him. That kind of silence breeds resentment. Sometimes enough to kill." Alyssa's lips curved in the faintest smile. "If I wanted Harold dead, why would I marry him?" Marianne held her eyes. "To make sure you were the last person he ever saw." Alyssa let out a soft laugh, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're reaching." Marianne slid a photograph across the table, the evidence bag containing the used condom. "This was found in your bathroom trash. Your husband's DNA, and DNA from another man. Both HIV positive. Different strains. A medical professional would know exactly what that means." Alyssa studied the photo for a long moment, then looked back at Marianne. "You can test every piece of evidence you want. You won't find my fingerprints on your theory." "You're right," Marianne said evenly. "We might not find prints, but we will find motive, opportunity, and a trail that leads right to you. People talk, Mrs. Bennett. Friends, co-workers, old army buddies who remember your father's death." Alyssa's posture remained perfect, but her fingers tightened slightly on her own wrist. "Then I suggest you find one of them who can say I pulled a trigger. Until then, detective, I'm a grieving widow who lost her husband less than a day after marrying him." Marianne closed the file, but her eyes never left Alyssa's. "You're not a grieving widow," she said quietly. "You're a woman who waited decades to take back what was stolen, and I'm going to prove it." Alyssa's smile returned, slow and deliberate. "Then I guess we'll see which of us runs out of time first." Marianne stood, the scrape of her chair loud in the small room. As she walked out, she knew 2 things. Alyssa had just confirmed her suspicions without saying a word, and this case had just become personal. By the time Alyssa Moore Bennett was formally charged with first-degree murder, the story had already taken over local news. Every night, TV anchors repeated the same sensational headline: "Bride accused of killing groom less than 24 hours after wedding." The courthouse steps became a stage. Protesters and supporters alike gathered, some waving signs that read justice for Harold, others holding photos of Daniel Moore with slogans like she avenged her father. Inside the packed courtroom, the air was heavy with anticipation. Judge Evelyn Hartman presided, her gavel striking sharp and loud. Alyssa sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit, her hair pulled back in a neat chignon, the image of composure. The prosecution opened first. Assistant District Attorney Michael Grant stepped to the jury box, his voice firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a case about grief or misunderstanding. This is about premeditation. The defendant, a trained nurse, married Harold Bennett with the intent to end his life, using a method she knew would be both lethal and difficult to trace. She poisoned his body with multiple HIV strains in a single night, ensuring his death within hours." He walked them through the evidence. The lab report on the condom, Harold's clean HIV test just 2 months earlier, and the testimony of a retired soldier linking Harold to the controversial death of Alyssa's father. The defense countered with equal force. Attorney Linda Chavez rose, addressing the jury with controlled intensity. "This case is built on speculation and circumstantial evidence. The prosecution wants you to believe that because my client's father died decades ago in questionable circumstances, she must have married Harold Bennett to kill him. Where is the direct proof? There are no fingerprints on the condom, no eyewitness to the alleged act, and no confession. What we have here is a grieving widow being painted as a monster because it makes for a good headline." The jury's eyes moved between the two women, the poised defendant and the relentless prosecutor's witness list. Reporters scribbled notes as Tommy Greer took the stand, recounting the night Daniel Moore died. His testimony painted a picture of cover-ups and silence, of a young daughter left without answers. Alyssa's eyes glistened during his words, but whether it was grief or performance was impossible to tell. By week's end, the public was divided. Talk radio shows buzzed with callers arguing both sides. "She's a cold-blooded killer who hid behind a wedding veil." "No, she's a daughter who finally saw justice done when the system failed her." When closing arguments came, ADA Grant's final words cut through the murmurs. "Marriage is built on trust. Harold Bennett trusted her with his life, and she took it, not in the heat of passion, but with chilling precision." Alyssa's attorney stood and, with a steady voice, left the jury with one final line. "You can't convict on what you think happened, only on what you can prove." The gavel fell, and the jury was sent out. The room buzzed with tension, because everyone knew, whatever the verdict, this case would leave no one truly satisfied. The jury was out for nearly 2 days. Each hour ticked by with the weight of uncertainty pressing on the courthouse. Reporters camped on the steps, shoving microphones toward anyone willing to speculate. Inside, Alyssa sat at the defense table, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the wood grain in front of her. When the bailiff finally announced, "We have a verdict," the air shifted. Everyone rose as Judge Hartman took her seat. The foreman stood, a folded piece of paper trembling slightly in his grip. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Alyssa Moore Bennett, guilty of manslaughter in the first degree. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, shock from some, outrage from others. The judge's gavel cut through the noise. Sentencing was set at 18 years, with a possibility of parole after 12. From the prosecution's table, ADA Grant's jaw tightened. It wasn't the victory he'd wanted. From the defense side, Linda Chavez placed a hand on Alyssa's arm, whispering something only she could hear. Alyssa's expression didn't change. In the weeks that followed, talk shows and editorials dissected the verdict. Some called it a miscarriage of justice, too lenient for a killing so cold. Others argued it was mercy for a woman who'd lived with unanswered questions about her father's death for most of her life. Inside the women's correctional facility, Alyssa adjusted quickly. She took a position in the infirmary, tending to inmates with a calm efficiency that unsettled some of the guards. "She's good at what she does," one admitted, But you can't forget why she's here. Detective Marianne Cole visited once, months later. She stood on the other side of the glass in the visiting room. Was it worth it? Marianne asked. Alyssa's lips curved into that same slow, deliberate smile she'd worn in the interrogation room. Justice always is. Marianne shook her head. Justice doesn't come with a body count. Alyssa leaned forward slightly, her voice low. Sometimes, detective, it has to. As Marianne left, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just spoken to someone who had no regrets, only unfinished business. Back in the small Texas town, Harold Bennett's grave became a quiet place for veterans to leave flags and flowers. Across town, a weathered photo of Staff Sergeant Daniel Moore still hung in his daughter's grandmother's living room, the frame polished as if waiting for the story to be rewritten. The case faded from national headlines, replaced by newer scandals, but in that town it remained an open wound. Was Alyssa Moore Bennett a cold-blooded killer who exploited love to settle a score? Or was she a daughter delivering the only justice her father would ever have? It depended on who you asked. And in that grey space between vengeance and justice, her story would live on, a reminder that sometimes the deadliest weapons are not bullets or blades, but patience, calculation, and the quiet smile of someone who's already decided how the story ends.